Okay, we'll get started, and we can catch those who weren't able to be here at the beginning up if they're able to come. So welcome to our third session of Parable Remix Volume 2 for us today, and we're going to be taking a look at the parable of the Good Samaritan today. This probably hands down has to be one of the most well-known parables out there. But we'll get to that in a moment. But let's take a moment and be in prayer as we begin our time today. Wonderful and gracious God, we give you thanks for this day. We thank you for this time and place, and we thank you especially, God, for one another, as we are able to come together and to study your word, this story that Jesus shared, that we can learn from each other, that your Spirit can speak to each and every one of us and help us all grow and learn and bear fruit to your glory. We pray that this time will draw us closer to you and closer to one another. In your name we pray, amen. All right. So as we start today, have you heard the parable of the Good Samaritan before? Right? Okay. Would you agree with me as saying this is probably the most well-known parable out there?
Yeah.
Of Jesus? I should have waited one more minute, shouldn't I? There's Ted and Gretchen. All right. So why do you say that it's the most common or well-known parable?
Well, there's even laws named
Mm-hmm.
in the Good Samaritan.
There's Good Samaritan laws. Yep, I'm familiar with those.
Well, it really addresses the human experience, I think, of helping another person, disregarding any other factors. I think it's ingrained in the human being to help someone when they're in need.
Okay, so too bad. Took a bite. So it is common. It speaks to something across all cultures. It speaks to our human experience of helping people in need. Okay, so it seems like it's universally applicable and understood. Okay, yeah. Yeah, it's everywhere, isn't it? We've got laws, we've got hospitals, we've got schools, everything named after the Good Samaritan. So, in your own words, what is this parable about? What is it that you hear? You know, when you hear someone say the parable of the Good Samaritan, can someone describe what it means in their own words?
Well, the way I look at it, the Samaritans were an absolutely disgusted, discarded, disliked group of Jewish people versus the regular Jewish people. And here's a guy, the Samaritan, who's really not, that group is particularly disliked, helping someone who is of the group that does the disliking. You know, I mean, because the man that he helped was of the Judea Jewish type faith, not the Samaritan faith. And I think it says that we can cross boundaries, whether we dislike that person or anything. If they need help, they need help.
Okay. So it's helping somebody no matter who they are.
Regardless.
Okay. All right. Yeah. I think that's pretty darn close to it, right? I think so. So we're going to dive into this a little bit. We're going to touch on some of the things that John brought up here in a moment. But let's just to refamiliarize ourselves, let's just take a moment and hear the parable from Luke, the Gospel of Luke, chapter 10, verses 25 through 37. And I'll read it for us today. And I'm reading from the New Revised Standard Version. So if you want to read along and you have a different version, there might be some differences to what you hear, but it's a pretty clear, commonly translated into the same.
What was the chapter?
Luke 10,
10.
verses 25 through 37. All right. So in one set of context here, this is Jesus has just been talking to a bunch of to his disciples who have gone out on their very first solo mission trips, so as to say, and they've come back and they've kind of been debriefing, and that's what the conversation is that we have when this parable starts. So from Luke 10, verse 25 through 37. Just then, a lawyer stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he said, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus said to him, "What is written in the law? What do you read there?" He answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And he said to him, "You have given the right answer. Do this, and you will live." But wanting to justify himself, he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers, who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now, by chance, a priest who was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. Likewise, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, while traveling, came near him, and when he saw him, he was moved with pity. He went to him, bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. And then he put him on his own animal and brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, Take care of him, and when I come back, I will repay you whatever more you spend. Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers?" And the man said, "The one who showed him mercy." And Jesus replied, "Go and do likewise." Okay, that's the familiar parable, right? We all knew what was going to happen, right? Okay. Just wondering if anybody had a different version of the Bible. Any differences jump out at you from what I read? You might have saw a teacher of the law instead of a lawyer, but it's really, it wouldn't be a lawyer like a criminal lawyer that we have today. Probably more so like a teacher, a professor.
Mine has an expert in
An
law.
expert. Okay, because they're talking about biblical law and Jewish law.
Are you talking about, I have Levite?
Yeah.
At the beginning, in the very first verse at 25,
No.
you should have a Levite in,
Oh, the teacher, the guy that you're talking about, the teacher of the law.
right, mm-hmm,
Oh, okay, you're
Mhm.
talking about him.
yeah,
Okay.
okay. Okay, any questions about the parable as you just heard it? Anything that you want to make sure that we, question you want to ask? Okay, so,
Okay, I have a question.
okay,
The Levite, weren't they kind of teachers of the law also? I mean, Levites were they more scribes or?
we're
what
gonna
was-
we're gonna touch on that.
Oh,
so-
okay, I'll just wait.
Okay, I will get to that answer. But yes, Levites would be, hold a special significance in the Jewish tradition. Okay. All right. So we all agree that this parable is exceedingly familiar, right? It's everywhere. And would you agree that being called a Samaritan, a good Samaritan, in today's vernacular and our world today would be seen as a good thing, right?
Yep.
Yes. Do you, and like John agreed, do you all realize that at the time that Jesus spoke this, while Samaritan was not a derogatory term, it would not be a good thing? Okay. So there's some significant, in its familiarity with us we are not shocked by this parable. But this parable is a parable that I believe that Jesus spoke to intentionally shock, provoke, and irritate and disturb the person who heard it. And the significance and the power and the provocativeness, or whatever the word might be, of this parable is there's so much that is lost because of how familiar, how incorporated it has become into our culture, that we lose a lot of the significance. So a lot of our conversation today is going to be really try to recapture some of that significance and that provocation that Jesus was doing here. He wanted, I'll just pause it. He wanted everybody to hear it, to walk away feeling, wow, that's hard. Okay. He did, this is a parable that is not supposed to be a warm fuzzy for you. Okay. Just
So
to cover.
would, in more recent terms, not totally recent, but 50 or 100 years ago, would it be like a member of the KKK helping a black man?
You're getting there.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
A
Yeah.
person with AIDS, or the mama with 5 dads of her babies, or.
So one of the things we're going to do today, I'm going to give you a little bit of time, is actually to retell it.
Yeah.
Okay. But let's understand. Let's build on why I say this. Okay. So John said the Samaritans, they were not universally hated. Okay. They weren't, a despised group of people. They were only despised by the Jews. Okay. Does anyone, and let's be honest too, the Samaritans kind of despised the Jews too. So anyone know why this is the case? Okay.
Half,
What?
half Jewish, half.
In Harry Potter terms, the Jews would consider the Samaritans mudbloods. These would be mixed ancestry.
Yeah.
Weren't the Samaritans Jews, but like a different sect within the organization?
You're close. Yes. Not a different sect.
Oh, they just believed otherwise.
No, they shared pretty much the same beliefs.
Oh,
They just happened to be from the north.
oh.
Okay. So to understand the hatred between Jews like that of Jesus's day, clearly Jesus does not hate the Samaritans. We see this throughout all of the Gospels, that Jesus seems to have a pretty darn good relation to it and never shies away from walking through Samaria in the Gospels. But we need to understand when the people of Israel came out of Egypt, they went back north into what they called the Promised Land, the land that God called to Abraham and Sarah and led them over to when God said to Abram, if you follow me, if you leave your home and your family and you follow me, I will take you to a land that will be yours, and I will make you a great family, and all your descendants will number greater than the stars in the skies and the sand upon the shore, and through you all the people of the world will be blessed. And where God took him was what we call Israel today. This strip from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. And kind of bound by the Mediterranean Sea, north and south as well. This in the times of the Egyptian occupation, when they were slaves in Egypt. They called that the promised land, that this was the land that God had promised Abraham, that was theirs by when the land that they left because of famine, where Jacob and all of his sons were, and so on. And this is where God would lead them back. There was a lot of talk about entering into the promised land and so on. And so they started out, once they got that land back, they became eventually a kingdom. And that was probably the decline of Israel at the time, is when they decided to become a kingdom. Because shortly after they became a kingdom, King Saul was the first king, then there was King David, and then Solomon, and then shortly after that, it just devolved, and there was civil war. Okay. And the kingdom broke north and south, essentially, north and south. Jerusalem, the holy city, where the temple was in the southern region, was in a region called Judah, because that's where Jacob's son Judah and his tribe and descendants were kind of told, this will be your land. When they first got there, they divided the land, the promised land, up into 12 sections based on the 12 sons of Jacob, the 12 tribes of Israel. So they broke in the southern area, stayed, and that was called Judah, and the northern kingdom kept the name Israel. But they needed a new capital, because the previous capital was Jerusalem, and that was squarely in the south control. So the northern kingdom bought some land and reclaimed it, and they bought this big hill in the city that was called Samaria, and that became the new capital of the northern kingdom of Israel. And that was probably the beginning of the animosity, because it went back to an ingrained disagreement, an ingrained hatred between the north and the south of Israel. Because why they broke was about, you're all doing it wrong, and so on. You're not doing things right, and we don't, we're going to break fellowship with each other. And that just built the foundation of the animosity. But where it really got bad was that the northern kingdom of Israel would sometime ally with the enemies of the southern kingdom of Judah, of Judea, and vice versa. And so then they started to really dislike each other that long term. And then when the Assyrians came through as an empire, they came through, and the southern kingdom paid them a bunch of money and were allies, and the northern kingdom got destroyed. And Assyria at the time took people from one part of the world that they would conquer. They would take a big chunk of the people, and they would move them and settle them into another part of the world. So they took a whole bunch of people, a whole bunch of Jews who were living they didn't call themselves Jews at the time, a whole bunch of Israelites who were living in the kingdom who would still practice the same faith, but just couldn't go to Jerusalem, to the temple. They went to the false temple in Samaria, and they took them and settled them throughout that northeast part of the Baltics there. we're talking Iran, Iraq, Turkey, that area. That's where all of our world wars start, that they took them there. But then they took a whole bunch of other people that they had conquered and plopped them down into what was once the kingdom of Israel. And that's how they maintained control of their vast empires. They just dispersed people, and they made them intermarry and intermingle, and so they would all be Assyrians, and not their own cultural kingdom identity. And that was probably the biggest thing, is because you couldn't say the southern kingdom that lasted a couple hundred years, a long time afterwards. They could claim that they were truly descendants of Abraham, where in that north, in those Sumerians, there were still people there who were of the Israelite tradition and culture, but they were intermarried, and they're next subsequent aren't real descendants of Abraham. So that also continued to grow the animosity, and the Syrians, instead of calling it Israel, called it Samaria, this region. The Syrians got destroyed by the Babylonians, and Babylonians didn't stop at the border. They just kept going and destroyed the southern kingdom, and they didn't cause people to intermarry. They just took the majority of the population and planted them into Babylon and said, get to work. And when finally Babylon was destroyed by the Persians, and the Persians let the Israelites go back, they went back to Jerusalem and started rebuilding it, and they started rebuilding the temple, and someone knocked on the door. And it was a bunch of Samaritans who were like, can we help rebuild the temple? Because that's our faith too. And the returning Israelite, the returning people who were from Judea, the southern kingdom, said, no, get your filthy hands off of our holy land and our sacred places. Go back, you degenerate people. Okay? So the Samaritans were like, well, bleepity bleep you. And there we go. They hated each other. They were basically the same. I guarantee you that the people who came back from Babylon were not genetically pure. Because the prophet Jeremiah said, go, plant your fields, buy a house, get married, have children, different things. But they hated each other. They thought they were deep ingrained misconceptions. They were deep ingrained cultural and religious, political identities that were defined over and against each other by the time that Jesus was there. And this man asked this question. Okay, so do you get an idea? It's not just fair enough to say the Jews hated the Samaritans, and the Samaritans hated the Jews. The only reason that they probably actually weren't fighting each other was that the Samaritans didn't have, they were just one particular region. They weren't really a true government. There was at least a kingdom in Jesus's day of, with an army. It was a puppet of Rome, of the Judeans in the south that could have just come in and kill them. It was probably just Rome that was keeping that from happening. Okay, they could not tolerate each other. But you couldn't get from Galilee to Jerusalem without walking through Samaria. You could do that trip maybe like in a day if you walked through Samaria, but Jews would go days around to avoid stepping foot in Samaritans in Samaria. Okay, do you have a better sense of that animosity?
Yes.
So, how, if any way, does that change as you think about the parable?
It's extraordinary.
How so? Why would you say it's extraordinary, John?
Well, with all this hatred, animosity, discord, that the Samaritan would stop to help someone from the other side is, there's such a, like the KKK helping a black guy in Alabama, chances are slim, none, and forget it, back in the 20s. And so I think it's kind of extraordinary that, because the Samaritan is the guy at the disadvantage, the way I see it. He's the disliked person. The other people are the ones in power, really.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's an exceptional act. I'm assuming it's a him, so I'm going to say it's exceptional act on his part.
In the parable,
Yeah.
Actually, no, there's not gender assigned to the Samaritan.
It says as he traveled.
Oh, okay. Yes, it does. So they do assign.
It doesn't say the man that was robbed was a Jew, though.
No. But can we assume that? There was a man who went from Jerusalem to Jericho. But so, were there other non-Jewish people living in Jerusalem? Yes, but you would have to assume, you could assume, but no, you can't totally. It could not have
Sorry,
been.
the Jewish people, who your neighbor is,
Mhm.
so it doesn't really matter.
But
Mhm.
if you saw a man beaten by the side of the road, how would you know that he was a Jew? I mean, maybe there's a way. But
Maybe John has a question later, and I just humorously thought, well, there'd be one way to tell.
Yeah, that's true.
Clothing, I don't
Um,
know. Their clothing, I suppose.
Yeah, it could be the clothing, yeah. There could be some ways you could identify, oh, that would be a Jew. But it doesn't have to be. So we can get just initially the shock, right? That the people hearing it. Any teacher of the law, any lawyer, expert would know that interacting with a Samaritan would defile yourself, would make you ritually unclean. Supposedly would anger God. But what else do we hear in this parable? This is not the only shocking thing. What else do we hear in this parable that is shocking?
Not only do you help, pay for then in the future too. I think
Mhm.
that's,
Yeah. Above and beyond?
not just getting them out of the streets, but.
The guy just didn't do
a
the
little.
minimum.
Yeah.
Okay, that is pretty provocative too. It wasn't just, I helped him, I got him back on his feet, I stabilized him and sent him on his way. No.
Well, I think it's shocking that these other two just walked by.
Yeah.
A priest,
Priest.
a priest, a holy man.
Mhm. The ones you would expect to do good, to help this person, didn't. So a priest, ceremonial, the priest is pretty much on the nose. I mean, you're talking about someone like me, right? I in this setting, in Christianity, we talk about priests. We are a priesthood of all believers, but a priest has a very specific role. Actually, the priest means to be one who mediates God and humanity. So you bring God to humanity and humanity to God. You would expect a priest to have known, love your neighbor as yourself, and help them. But
If you go back to movies, and I don't know how true this is, but you look at the depiction of Jewish priests in that time, and they were above all that. That wasn't their job to take care of that. They were, I think that, I'm saying this is from movies, I don't know what it was like, but they seemed holier than thou and therefore not my job description kind of thing.
Yeah, they couldn't bloody their hands.
Right.
How could, technically, by Jewish law, if that priest got blood on his hands,
Well, you would literally,
he would have to go through probably significant amount of work to become ritually clean again so that he could function as a priest. I mean, 'cause these were guys who wore bells on the bottom of their robes and have rope ties to their ankles when they walked into the holiest of holy parts of the temple, because if there was anything impure in them, they were struck dead. And if the bell stopped ringing, the guys on the outside would pull the rope to pull the body out. You couldn't go anywhere near the Ark of the Covenant, the Holy of Holies, where the hem of God's robe manifested on earth, and with any impurity and not be killed. So they took this seriously. There was a significant amount of cultural. But Jesus knows that. His uncle was a high priest. His uncle was one of the guys who went into the Holy of Holies. That's where Zechariah got, in the Gospel of Luke, we hear Zechariah is in the Holy of Holies when God tells him you're going to have a son, John the Baptist. Jesus would have known this. No one would have expected Zechariah or any of the priests, like as Gretchen said, to have done anything.
How about get help though? Not necessarily physically touch, because that's kind of where the defilement kind of came in, but go find somebody and say, hey,
Yeah.
you could go help.
wasn't that part of Jesus's accusations, that there was no compassion,
Sure.
that they really didn't care
So-
for the people?
So he's I mean, they would, that would have been shocking to hear, even to this expert of the law, that Jesus is throwing the priests under the bus here. Not only did the priest not touch the man, what did he do? Completely avoided the man.
Well, and this is answering the question, who is my neighbor? Because I'm sure they were looking for him to say, oh, only the ones you go to church with, or only the friends in your circle, or only, was the answer they were trying to get out of Jesus, I think.
Right. Absolutely. That's kind of the next question.
Yeah.
What does the most important part of understanding this parable is the question that it answers. Who is my neighbor?
Every human being.
And Jesus, in response to it, doesn't just say every human being. He goes into this parable. But here's the thing. The role that you get put in, if you're going to put yourself into a role in this parable, what role do you think you get to take? And if you say the Samaritan, no. You say the priest or the Levite, maybe. But definitely, Jesus is in this parable wants you to stop and think. You're the man, you find yourself laying in the mud, bleeding out. Who do you want to stop by? Now, to answer Gretchen's earlier question, the Levite. The Levites are another tribe of Israel. So from the very beginning, even in the book of Numbers, or during the time of Exodus, when the people of Israel are leaving Egypt and going back to the promised land, they're organized into these tribes based on their ancestry going back to Jacob. And then from Jacob to Isaac to Abraham. But Jacob was the first one of those three who had multiple children. And so the Levites were the descendants of Levi. And they were, in the book of Numbers in Exodus, identified as a very special tribe who had very important religious and ceremonial roles and responsibilities to the corporate worship in the Jewish faith or the Hebrew faith at the time. And so if you were a Levite, just by your birth, you were considered to have special responsibilities in the faith, and you had to do things. So Levites were always looked to be leaders within the faith of Judaism. And we can say Judaism at this time because Judea is where we get the word Jews. That's what the Romans called it. They didn't call them by, oh, that's a system of faith. Those are the people of Judea, Jews. So the Levites played a really important part, leadership within the faith community. Not necessarily priests, but they were always looked to as, we might call them our lay leaders or our elders. These would be the people that if you had a question about faith and you didn't want to go to the priest, you'd go find a Levite. And Jesus throws them under the bus as a whole. So this would have been really challenging to that, to everyone hearing this. Okay, there is no strata of the Jewish faith that comes out of this looking good. And then the one who you have to answer, which one was a neighbor to the man hurt, is the one I hate the most. Okay? So.
Yeah, he wouldn't even say the word Samaritan. He didn't say it was a Samaritan. He said it's the one who had mercy on him.
Oh, that's subtle, Holly. I didn't, yeah. Didn't want to dirty his mouth with the word. Yeah. Okay. Good point, Holly.
Do you know
One who had
why,
mercy.
I don't know beforehand, do you know why the attorney asked this question? Do you think is he testing Jesus? Or
Yes.
is he wanting to learn himself?
Verse 25. At least Luke here is saying the lawyer stood up to test Jesus.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Now, there were a lot of rabbis, there were a lot of teachers in Judea at the time who taught things about what it meant to be a Jew. And there were competitions. It would kind of be like schools, like if I follow Rabbi Benjamin or I follow Rabbi Jesus. Rabbi is just the main, word to say teacher. So when he says teacher, he's, in Hebrew, in Aramaic, he would have said Rabboni.
He was an expert in Torah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so they would examine, they would challenge each other and test each other. So sometimes it was good. And other times it was because they were trying to test and trap Jesus for trying to discredit him. There was most certainly by this time, even in the Gospel of Luke, it's early on, relatively early on, there is, what Jesus is teaching is not comfortable. And just look at the parable we heard. It is not comfortable to the established religious order or the established social status quo, right? And so they were trying to challenge and discredit him. So if Jesus had just said, everybody, every human being is your neighbor, the guy would have scoffed and laughed and said, well, not someone who's going to make me ceremonially unclean and break the covenant, and put me, but Jesus is.
I have scripture to prove it.
Right. The scripture here was, darn it. I would have, imagine the guy was thinking, more along the expletives, because you can't discredit what Jesus just said there. Because that's exactly what the Bible also says. If there's someone hurt and bleeding in front of you, you better help them. That's how you show love. So was his motivation just to try to test Jesus to see if he really knew what Scripture meant? Or was he trying to test and trap Jesus? We're not entirely sure. But he most certainly was trying to put Jesus in a spot. And Jesus turned it around and put him in a very uncomfortable spot himself for that. So you get an idea of just how shocking the Samaritan was, and just how shocking Jesus throwing the priest and the Levite under the bus was too, right? So would you say it's safe to say that this isn't just a parable for you to apply individually to your life? Do you think this is a parable that we could apply in more general terms
Yes.
to like a congregation, a denomination, to an entire religious institution like Christianity? Do you think this can be applied on higher scales? Okay, good.
Well, I was just thinking about it. Let's modernize this parable.
Well, I was just going to have you guys do that.
Oh.
So if you have your little notebooks here, I want you guys to think of how would you rewrite this. You don't have to rewrite it out, but kind of identify the roles here of how would you write this out, and then we can share those. Okay. So just think about who you would put that in there. We've heard some examples, so I'll say you can't use the KKK in the South, but that's what we're talking about. However, I will say, just to give you another hint, since it brought up the interaction between KKK and African Americans, you got it wrong though. You got it backwards.
I was thinking about that after I said it.
It's not a black man beat up in the ditch.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a member of the KKK
Mhm.
beat up in the ditch, and a black man stops and helps him.
Right.
Okay?
Yeah.
That's the parable. So think about that, however, for you today, or for something. Okay? Just think about that. Okay. Anyone want to? Everybody have some ideas of roles? Okay, so let's start. We've got the question. Someone asks you, but who is my neighbor? How would you retell this parable? Dave, you
I'm driving down Highway 47 in the winter, and I have it run off the road on icy pavement. Airbags go off, I bruise my ribs, I bang my head, I'm semi-conscious, and a family, or a guy from Lac de Flambeau comes and pulls me out of my car and helps me out.
Parable of the Good Indian. Okay. Who would you have expected to, in your version of it, to have stopped and helped you?
Pastor Mark, throw him under the bus.
Amen?
Right, I left out the people that.
And Pastor Mark saw it, oh, that must be Dave's car in the ditch.
But you've got 3 kids, you don't know it's Steve, and.
You have to get them to practice, the kids, right?
Yeah.
Right,
Right.
I don't want to get sued because those pesky Good Samaritan laws are getting tested now.
yes, really.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I had an interesting experience this summer. You know where the Harley Davidson dealership is? I was on my way, this was August, I was on my way up to a funeral in Manitowish Waters, and I don't know where it came from, but a deer came out, hit the front of my enclave, steam's coming out. I was only going 45, so there was no injuries, but I pulled over, obviously. I tell you, within less than 2 minutes, 5 cars stopped, people got out, and I was dressed with a jacket, shirt, tie, you know, a funeral, and they all came out, are you okay, are you okay, are you okay? I was fine because I was, oh heck, my airbag didn't even go off.
Right.
But the point is that within, I'd say less than 2 or 3 minutes, there were 5 people who I had no idea who they are. I don't even know what state they came from, but they all stopped, got out of cars, ran across 51 to see if I was okay or if I needed any help.
Yeah.
Now, I call that a good collection of Good Samaritans.
Okay.
How
Good.
long ago, when did this happen?
Pardon?
When did this happen?
August this summer.
Oh, this year?
I will say this, that wonderful deer totaled my enclave.
All right, Dave, thank you. Thank you for sharing your role. Yeah, it's challenging in our community and in communities that live in close proximity to Native American reservations and communities. It's an uneasy relationship, isn't it? You know, I grew up in a place in between the Bad River and Red Cliff reservations, and numerous of my classmates were Native American, just like what we have here in the Lakeland area. But you know, I heard jokes of, you know, how do you get a Native American to pick up his work boots, put his welfare check underneath it? We had there were horrible relationships, and we had horrible misunderstandings of who we were, and so much so that, you know, there were always comments about, well, that's, up here, and in this area we've had the spearing wars, right? Tremendous distrust and dislike of the two communities of people. So that would be an incredibly accurate or meaningful telling of this story in our particular community that Dave brought up.
Well, I'm gonna bring up mine because this is why I'm coming to this church as much as I am, is the Syndeo, and you at the church wrapping yourself around that family, the gay guy with 3 foster kids, and you guys loved him. So I've never yet had another church. I have so many families that could, use a group, and you'll get one here, one there. I'll get them through all the training, and then, I don't have money for the food, or there's every excuse or every whatever. And how you guys did that is just, touched me. I was just with the mama this week with a newborn drug baby, and she's got 2 2-year-olds, and one's from 2 different different native tribes from different counties. But, she just keeps taking these babies in because, everybody says they want to help, and it's really easy to send shoe boxes to Africa or whatever, and I'm not saying those programs are bad, but I really get tired of our communities not being there even for our foster kids. I mean, that's my heart thing. So,
So you could almost say, someone's hurt, and the person who helped him is a foster kid.
Yeah.
Because that word foster does have a label on it.
Yeah, and they think of them as bad kids or whatever, and some of them are just in bad situations.
They're just horribly traumatized kiddos.
Yeah.
But you would know that if you said that parable of what Dave just described, around here, it would definitely raise eyebrows. Okay. Any other, and Kathy, you shared that idea of foster. Who else wants to share how you would, someone asks you, who is your neighbor?
Okay, so I'm driving through Kansas City, Missouri, and it's raining and it's cold, and I have a tire blowout, and I can't get the lug nuts off to change myself. So the police officer drives by and never stops, and then the ambulance driver drives by and never stops, and the cab driver drives by and never stops. No, from underneath the cardboard box comes this homeless man, dirty as sin, walks up and says, "Can I help you?" Stands out in the pouring rain, he's already wet, and he's changing my tire. anyone take anything from her.
That's a true story. Is that a true story?
But-
Oh, okay.
What did I do?
It was believable.
Stop.
Yeah.
A homeless man came out from underneath a piece of
But
You're a good storyteller,
Yeah.
Donna. Mm-hmm.
But how does this parable work in a city like New York or Chicago, where you absolutely do not want to be involved with anyone you don't know? And you could possibly be sued for even helping someone because you're not adequately trained. It puts a real stress on this parable.
You could always call 911 and at least get the police there.
Well,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank goodness for cell phones, because I don't stop anymore.
but if
Well,
you
not
saw
that I
someone
did.
bleeding out from being stabbed on the sidewalk, are you gonna take the time to call 911 or are you gonna try to stop the bleeding? 911 to me is not a Good Samaritan move. That's
Well,
just,
it depends on what the situation is.
Let's just put it on George Floyd.
Yeah.
Man was murdered in plain daylight by a police officer. Okay, perfect. I mean, this is the story. If anybody went and touched him, they would be in jail. They were arresting the other officers involved were arresting people who were trying to intervene.
yeah.
Okay, the Good Samaritan Act was, this is wrong. I'm not going to let you tell me that it's not. Okay, so one aspect of this is this parable just, you could say, is this parable telling you that you have to directly physically intervene in some of these situations? If you can, yes. But what do you do if you don't? If you can't, can you step in? Is this parable saying that you have to step in to an active armed robbery? No. Does this mean that you need to be the first person running into a mass shooting situation? No. Does this mean that you have to go and confront the drug dealer who's in your no. But you do have a responsibility. If you recognize that this situation is wrong, is not okay, that there are people being hurt, is it okay just to walk away? Just block it out. It's not me. And walk around and continue on with your life. Remember, we all said this can be applied not just at an individual level. So let's stop and think. Why? Why did this event happen? Why did George Floyd get murdered by a police officer in Minneapolis? So there's lots of questions. What went on in Derek Chevron's life that built that hatred? How do we address that? The generational systematic racism that is being taught to white America. Why is it that police officers tend to be more violent people?
Because their criminals are more violent people.
And the job attracts
Yeah.
people who are more aggressive.
With the adrenaline rush.
One of the they're taught a lot of times. Policing has been taught to you control the situation by being more powerful and more authoritative than whatever is going on. Whereas most effective forms of controlling a situation is to de-escalate it, right? But that's not, so then you could look, there's so many different places that in a situation like that you could look at a cause. Did this contribute to it? Is that something I can work on? Am I a member of this community, voting member of this community, that I could work to advocate for policy changes, training changes? Maybe I could not have directly intervened in this particular situation, but I could do, there is something I can do because I am aware of that situation. Okay? Now, in today's world, you're aware of everything. Okay, so it isn't a parable that is supposed to make you feel guilty that I didn't, because you can't. Okay, and I don't think that's exactly what Jesus is trying to make you feel, like you have to solve everybody's problem. Okay,
The problem with being overwhelmed by having everyone be your neighbor,
mm-hmm.
you know, all 7 billion of us, or whatever the number is, I don't recall, is that you can then wall yourself off and say, well, now nobody's my neighbor.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it might have, you know, in the old days, maybe, you know, charity begins at home, and you take care of the people in your church or in your town, you know, whatever. You see, you can visualize and have the capacity to deal with
Mm-hmm.
the issues that you're presented with. And now we're presented with almost an infinite number of possibilities for how we might be able to
Yes.
help.
Mm-hmm.
You know, should I put it? We have the same dilemma at the church with our mission money stuff. Should I put $1 here and $1 here, $1 here, $1 here, $1 there?
Right. Right.
Or should we focus on something like food insecurity?
Mm-hmm.
And,
yeah.
So that we're being more effective in a narrower way. Mm-hmm. I don't know. It just to me.
But here, what is Jesus really challenging with this parable?
I think he's saying that don't say in your mind or in your heart, just because they're black or just because they have the India gem on their forehead or because they're gay or because they're, you know, green, I don't care,
Mm-hmm.
to not help them. There isn't any reason to not help somebody that you can help.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I take from it.
I think
In the George Floyd example, who's who? Okay, so say the George Floyd is at the bottom of the, yeah, George Floyd is the Samaritan that comes to help. It's the, I don't know if that's important or not. I mean, is the Good Samaritan story reflective of the, or, what do I want to say?
The Good Samaritan in that situation was the paramedics and the police officers actually got him off of George Floyd.
And the person taking video.
And the
like
person
you said, 'cause
taking
that's how we
video.
all know.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it doesn't
The
happen.
unexpected, but, you know, here, one thing to stop and think about in trying to think about this parable, you know, how is it going to apply to your life, or, you know, how do we do this? How do we manage the scope that it means? Because the intention of this parable is to widen the scope, is to challenge our perceptions, okay? Because the perception that the man was asking, who is my neighbor? If you're going to ask that question, it reveals something really powerful about you, significant about you, you know? And if you have to ask, who's my neighbor? Then there's people that you don't want to be your neighbor, right? And that's the perception that Jesus is really challenging here, is who is it that you don't want to love? Who is it that you don't want to help you? And that's why I said, you know, the KKK and the black man are really good examples. You know, that KKK guy, would he take the man's hand if he said, "Here, let me help you up," and it was a black hand? Do you think he would have reached out and taken it? Do you think he would? Maybe he would have. It was like, "Oh crap, I'm going to die if I don't." Maybe he would have taken it. But do you think it went through his mind?
You didn't tell any friends.
Crap. It's a black man. Right? That's what Jesus's perception is challenging here. So in Dave's response, yeah, in Jesus's time, first hearing, you were much more, I look around and I only see these people. We look around today and see the entire world, right? And it's burning. Can you as an individual solve that? No. Can we as a congregation solve that? No. But we as a congregation is one thing that we see, we can work at. We're going to go and do the food security. So it's not saying, what it's kind of saying is, yeah, I am responsible at an individual level to acknowledge and see that there's something broken. That people are not okay. People are being oppressed. People are being mistreated. People are going hungry. People are being killed. There's genocide. There's war. There's climate change. There's all of these things. There's systematic institutional religion or racism. I'm taking a course in dealing with religious trauma, which is now in a recognized mental illness from people who have been traumatized by the church. So there are people out there in our world that if you were going to tell them this, you would tell them the parable of the good Christian, and they wouldn't want to believe it.
I read the Duger's book, The One Girl. I mean, that's a perfect example.
So it challenges us to just stop looking at ourselves or those like us and to acknowledge that there are others out there and that we are responsible for each other. But to kind of end this for us, to make us each feel a little uncomfortable.
As we are talking.
Like I told you last week, you don't get away. This is, it's a feel-good parable about helping each other. Nope. This is a parable about taking the blinders off of your eyes and your heart and seeing people. So I'm going to end with the question. Who would be the last person or group of people that you would want to have stopped and helped you?